day, it's going to step us through kind of part by part. And I especially like this is a second round on it because it's sort of like having that thinking outline for you. Sometimes when we look at how do I approach timed writing, how would I deconstruct the prompt, you're kind of just left with, well, annotate it. And for some people, they're not sure about what that process looks like and how to do it. This kind of breaks it down. So we're going to start with the actual prompt itself. You notice that this one has 4 sentences to it. Most AP prompts have 3 sentences. Your background, your charge, and then the actual question. But here we get that weird lingering fourth sentence, not question. What do you notice that the second sentence of the prompt tells you that's going to help us in understanding the question?
I think it shows that he was just told that he was demoted because the spokesman is the person, I'm guessing that's what he said to tell him he's fired.
Yeah, so we have the immediate reaction to his news. And how is he processing this? Look at that second sentence. Did you mark the word alone? So if he's alone on stage, we know that this is a soliloquy. And so this extra sentence is meant to try to push students to that understanding of, I need you to process this as a soliloquy. We know how we deal with soliloquies. We know that they are an externalization of an interior thought. We know that soliloquies have a kind of flow to them, a beginning, a middle, and an end, if you will. We see a presentation of what's going on right now as they reflect on it. We see them figure out how to move forward and then usually develop a plan. And so here we're going to see Wolsey process in chunks. And this is important because of the word that's in our actual question. What is it that we have to do here for this essay? What are we being asked to do? Write an essay about what?
About the elements used to display Wolsey's complex response.
Mm-hmm.
About this.
So when you went through, did that word stand out to you as needing to be complex? On their scoring for this essay, this is how they are going to be able to show and discriminate the boys from the men, if you will, your higher scoring essays from your lower scoring. Can you talk about complexity here rather than just what is Wolsey thinking? And so we know that we're going to have to look for some things like shifts. We know that we're going to need to see that contradictory idea. And it's probably going to be presented in a multifaceted way. So we've talked about multifaceted before, that there are multiple sides to it. He's not just angry, he might be angry yet sad. That way we can see, okay, there's more than one emotion going here. We're now going to start to look at the actual passage. Yes, this is on question 1, and so students are expected to be able to see how this functions in a poetic way. But we can also, you've seen the rubrics for these questions. You know that question 1 is scored practically the same way question 2 is. They're both passage analysis questions. So really, we've got to find how the meaning is present here. And a good way to start is to track the sentences. So we're going to break this thing apart into sections based on the sentences. So first, you're going to draw a line after line 2. Between line 2 and line 3, we're going to draw a line. That's going to be our first section. Then between lines 9 and 10, you're going to draw a line. That's going to be our second section. Lines 10 and 11 are going to be our third section. 12 to 15 is section 4. We're going to look at just line 16 as its own thing. Lines 17 through 21 are going to be a section. And then the last 2 together. And so we're going to kind of chunk this as we move through it so that we can see what we have. And so you notice that we have this bit to kind of guide us here on this thinking. I'm working through this, though I may not be using every question as is. Let's start with the first section, those first 2 lines that we have here. How would you describe the tone of those first 2 lines?
Very sad. Just like, oh, woe is me.
Bless you, by the way. Okay. Anybody have a different word that stands out to them about how to read the first 2 lines? Okay, so let's pull in syntax to help us out here, because you notice that there's a lot of different types of punctuation here in these first 2 lines. We have an em dash, we have a period, we have a question mark, we have an exclamation. He's just been dismissed from his place. So the first 2 words make sense, so farewell. But then he says, to the little good you do me. Is that genuine? There's a little bit that you're going, no. And then we look at the second line and he says farewell as a question. Okay. He knows that he was told farewell. So this is functioning as a rhetorical question. It's in response to how he's feeling. And he says, a long farewell to all my greatness, with an exclamation. Now we are kind of tone deaf to exclamation points now, because you need like 1,000 of them in a text message for somebody to get your point, because everything has an exclamation point when we text. Everything! Hi! How are you? You know it does. Don't, some of you are looking at me like, no. And you know, when you want to make your point, it's like 12 exclamation points fair across. But when we look at text like this, exclamation points really should stand out to you to help to convey the tone. If I said that this tone has an air of sarcasm and bitterness to it, can you see how that exclamation point and that rhetorical question are now playing into that a little better? We are a very cynical society, so sarcasm is hard for us sometimes to see in print because we just expect it everywhere. But we need to see that he is not just sad here, but there is a bitterness to this tone. And it's illustrated through that syntax. Did you notice as I talked through that, I'm using what I noticed with the literary device to point towards how are we building meaning? When we're looking at creating an essay that's going to push our score into a 3 on row B, we need to be able to show, here's how the author creates the meaning, here's the meaning that's created, and how it helps us to get this response. So he definitely is upset. He is having a pity party here, but we need to see the bitter, sarcastic, angry tone that comes along with it. As we move into this next part, we want to look at line 3 and we want to stay with syntax once again. Syntax draws us towards the construction of the sentence and the punctuation. Line 3 has a colon in it. He says, this is the state of man. Colons are used primarily for 2 things. One is a definition, and 2 is a list. So if I was going to write a list in a sentence by saying, I gathered the equipment I would need to go camping, colon, what would be some of the things that would follow that colon? Sleeping bags, tents, food. I'm creating a list based on what I said in the first part. If I'm using it for a definition, I would say, this is the state of man, throw a colon in, and then use the rest of the sentence to define what the state of man is in my opinion. What we are noticing as we go is this colon becomes it introduces an extended metaphor. He is going to use a metaphor to describe his view of the state of man. This view of the state of man is informed by his tone in the first two lines. He has just been taken out of his position as advisor to the king. He is bitter, and he is sad, and he is upset. And so let's look at how he talks about what the state of man is. Today he puts forth the tender leaves of hope. Tomorrow blossoms and bears his blushing honors thick upon him. The third day comes a frost, a killing frost. And when he thinks good easy man, full surely his greatness is a ripening, nips his root, and then he falls as I do. Okay, there's a lot here to unpack. So let's start with this explanation of the extended metaphor. How does he picture the state of man? If you had to describe it in your own words, how does this metaphor work?
Rest will build you up and you can become successful, but then right as you finally achieve what you want, you're knocked back down to the first level.
Yes, so you see what he is saying about the state of man, that you will gain and be set up for greatness, and right as you're about to achieve it, something will cut your legs out from you and you will fail. Well, does that make sense given the fact that he's just been fired from his job as advisor to the king? Absolutely. Now let's talk about the actual metaphor that's used here. What season are these 3 days taking place during? Say it again. Spring. A common misread here is to see this as winter, but we need to see it as spring. Why? Bingo. We live in a weird state in Texas because stuff blossoms all year long. But traditionally, blossoms come about in spring. And when they come about in the early spring, it may be at a time where we get a sudden frost that comes out of nowhere because the weather's still a little wonky and may kill that blossoming flower. And so when we see how this metaphor works, he's using it as a way to talk about right as I'm about to become a full-fledged flower, oh my gosh, something comes in and I die. I fall. Talk to me about some of the words that stand out to you here if we wanted to talk about diction. What words in this extended metaphor help us to understand his viewpoint on the state of man and how he sees his situation? Yes, so notice the choice of 3 days. He's limiting this thing. What other words stand out to you if we talked about diction? How he is building this metaphor to help us to understand his thinking. Say it again. Yes. Notice that what takes him out isn't just a frost, but a killing frost. Now here's where we have to get a little bit into nuance. Is frost natural? Yes, I know you're looking at me like that's a stupid question, Walsh. Why are you asking that? Like I'm a senior. Yeah, of course it's natural. So does it have a malicious intent? No. Some people would want to look at this and go, oh, well, this is personification. You're giving a natural thing human-like qualities. Can frost kill plants? Yes. So it's not personified. We're not giving it something that it doesn't already do. What instead we're doing is coloring our perception of what's happening. A thing that comes about naturally took me out. And that's key. He's framing this entire thing in nature. Are kings natural? Are advisors natural? Mm-hmm. But is the role of advisor something that naturally happens? No. So notice that in a system that is not natural, Wolsey was fired. But when he talks about the state of man, what man should expect and how life works, his entire metaphor is based on nature, which can help us to see, does Wolsey understand that this was inevitable?
Yes.
We can be frustrated with it, but it's inevitable. Hate to break it to all of you, but one day you're all going to die. Now, we're going to be disappointed when it happens. Absolutely. What a bummer. But it's natural. This is going to help us to understand where he's going to go as he progresses through this soliloquy. But I wanted to point it out while we're talking here. If we notice the diction of the metaphor is helping us to understand the framing of the metaphor and his intended meaning. What are there other words that you're seeing that we can point out before I start to show you what we should be noticing? How does he describe the motion of the leaves on day one? He describes them as tender leaves, right? So tender obviously has that idea of soft. They're fragile, but it's also the way that this plant is slowly coming into its own. There's an uncertainty to it. It puts forth the tender leaves of hope. So to Wolsey, the state of man begins with this slight chance, this step that's taken, but it's hopeful. What happens the second day?
The flower blossoms.
It blossoms, but then notice how he modifies it by saying, it bears his blushing honors thick upon him. If the first day we had the hope that things would succeed, they do succeed, but then he modifies it by talking about the blushing honors that you get. What leads Wolsey into thinking he's going to be successful? It's not just the fact that he became successful, it's the fact that he bared his blushing honors upon him as people praised him. He blushed. He showed it. And so when the unexpected does happen on day 3, suddenly, though it is natural, it catches him off guard. And he says, and when he thinks, good, easy man, full surely his greatness is a ripening. Remember, we go from hope to honors that are blushing upon you to this idea of it's not just a flower, it's my greatness. You see how this metaphor works in an extended way and how it's highlighted through the diction choices he's making. Everybody following me? Does this make a little more sense now where you're going, okay, I feel a little bit more comfortable? So this is section 2. Let's move to section 3. Section 3, like we said, is going to pick up these just next couple of lines. He says, I have ventured like little wanton boys that swim on bladders this many summer in a sea of glory. We go from one metaphor to another metaphor. So let's pull it apart the same way we did this one. Now, instead of a flower, how does he see himself? A child, a boy. What are things we associate with boys?
Maturity.
Immaturity. Is it always their fault that they're immature, though? They're children. So what do they possess that usually leads them to being immature? There's an innocence. We might even call it a naive or naivete to them. They don't understand what's happening around them all the time. And so he says here, I have ventured like little wanton boys that swim on bladders. And here you have a definition. When we're talking about bladders, think about a raft. They were on an inner tube. And where was that inner tube? In a sea of glory. Well, now all of a sudden you're going, oh, drew that line wrong. Let's try that again. There we go. That's a little better. Notice that we do this sea of glory thing and we connect it back to the blushing honors. And we're going, oh, so we're talking once again about your career as advisor. You approached it like a little boy and you were wanton. Now they choose not to gloss wanton for you, but they glossed bladder, which I was surprised by. Anybody have a good definition of the word wanton? Use the God machine in front of you. Look it up. Tell me what the word wanton means. Okay. Is there a separate definition?
Some weird ones. Play, frolic.
Okay.
Because a lot of the other ones are sexual.
And that's, here's the thing. I need you to see those ones a little bit. Not for the sexual nature. We're not going to turn this into some kind of a weird thing. But when you look at the definitions that deal with a sexual thing, it's this idea of a desire that you want to fulfill. You want something. You're searching something out. You're looking for fulfillment. Bring just that. Drop the sex part, but bring that idea of a wantonness to this. Yeah, this unrestrained thing. I'm like a little boy on a raft in the sea, a wanton little boy. I want to be fulfilled, unrestrained. I want to have that in this sea of glory. And you're going, okay, that's how you viewed yourself. And then notice that we have the big but. Let's shift it. But what does he say?
He had his pride was the bladder, like the thing that he kept him up in his sea of glory, had broke under him, and now he was.
Yes, so notice that the shift here says, I used to be like this, but I found that I went beyond my depth. Anybody ever have that issue if you've been in the ocean or a pool where you're not paying attention and then all of a sudden you look around and you're way deeper than you should be and you kind of freak out a little bit? He's having that moment as he's building this metaphor. I'm like this boy, I wanted so much, but I got in over my head. And once I realized that I was, what was buoying me up, this inner tube, was my pride. It burst under me, he says, and now has left me weary and old with service, to the mercy of a rude stream that must forever hide me. So in this metaphor, notice that he goes from being a boy to being what? So in the first metaphor, we kind of introduced this flower that is just budding and has stopped before, but here he's at least willing to admit, I might have gone into this as a boy, but I am now coming out a weary old man at the mercy of a rude stream. Before I used to think I was in control on the sea of glory, but now I've realized it's not a sea. It's not an open space of water. It's a stream that's moving me in one direction. And it's not good. And it's going to hide me away forever. Because what is likely going to happen? If you are the advisor to the king and you are being removed from your position, what is likely going to be the next step?
Possible execution.
Mm-hmm. Especially when you consider at the top of the page, which history play is this? And what do we know about Henry VIII? He killed a bunch of his own wives when they got in the way. And so execution is definitely what he's realizing is the next step. And you're going, oh. So let's talk about what we are seeing so far, because we have noticed here we have a major shift. We go from someone who begins this in a mix of sad and bitter. as he talks about this first extended metaphor about our flower, it's all based in nature. So is Wolsey's talking about inevitability, right? But is it his fault? No, he frames his first extended metaphor to be like, this killing frost comes out of nowhere. It might be inevitable, but I didn't do it. As he gets to this second extended metaphor, is he now coming to understand his own culpability? What does he say is the thing that got him in trouble here? His pride. So now we have some ownership. We go from the bitter beginning where it's like, ugh, this is no good. Oh man, the state of men, all men are going to end up like this. For him now to go, oh wait, maybe not all men. Only those that have a highborn sense of pride and don't pay attention to what's happening. We're becoming a little more specific as he's accepting. Think about in your own head when you have had news that really wasn't good and it didn't go your way. It takes us some processing time to move away from anger and bitterness to starting to come to a place of acceptance. And we're seeing that here on the page as Wolsey processes. This second metaphor starts that process, and we move into our next section. It's the single line, line 16. Notice what ends the line. What do we notice syntactically? That's what he's going to do, but what do you notice syntactically at the end of the line? We end this with a exclamation point. And so we go from these extended metaphors where we're explaining and processing to a single line exclamation where he curses himself, if you will. Vain pomp and glory of this world, I hate ye. We're going, oh, well, this is the logical conclusion. Now that he's figured this out, he's going to, I hate it. It's led him down this path. Now that he has come to understand, accept, and put that note in, we now need to see, okay, well, where are we going to go? And in the next few lines, he talks about that. He says, I feel my heart new opened. And you're like, okay. Once he's had the exclamation, he now recognizes the change. He says, oh, how wretched is that poor man that hangs on prince's favors. Now, obviously, he dealt with a king. But here, notice the diction choice. He now sees himself as what? The word he chooses to use is poor. Not in terms of money, but in terms of pity. We can link this old man, this weary old man. He now sees himself as a weary, poor old man worthy of pity. Ashamed to be that person that hangs on the favors of a king. He says, there is betwixt that smile we would aspire to. This is the blushing honors he looked at early. When someone smiles at you and gives you a compliment. That sweet aspect of princes. So between those nice honors and their ruin, more pangs and fears than wars or women have. He's basically saying between these good moments and these bad moments, man, there's a lot. And he ends it with this illusion. How many of you tried to write about the illusion in your first draft? But you found that all you were really doing was repeating what's here. Now remember, the purpose of an illusion is to reference an already understood story, character, something. It's like an in-speak, but it's meant to help us to process and understand it at a deeper level than just the literal. They tell you here in your note, hey, Lucifer, got it. He's Satan, the fallen angel. Okay. So most of the time when students want to write about this illusion, they're like, oh, he uses the illusion of Lucifer because, Wolsey fell from a place and Lucifer fell from a place. Done. And they don't pay attention to the last line of the soliloquy. We need to see that Wolsey has taken a journey through the soliloquy. And he started angry and bitter. He is frustrated with himself and he sees it as not his fault. This is a natural thing that happened to me. But by the end, he is coming to accept the likely outcome of death. When Lucifer was kicked from heaven into hell, Yeah, he fell from it. But there was also the understanding that there is no coming back from this. You have aggrieved a God that is supposedly forgiving and been put in a place where it's like there is no chance to be forgiven. You are done. And so here, where we have hope as a part of this early piece, remember the flower puts forth the tender leaves of hope that first day. He is now understanding by the end that, like Lucifer, he is left here never to hope again. And so we're seeing that journey and that arc. Everybody feel better with the entire piece now. Is there anything that you're looking at that you're like, okay, we didn't talk about this, I still don't, or we did talk about it and I don't quite understand what's going here? All right, so let's take our step out. In order to write this prompt, we have to talk about Wolsey's complex response. So if we go back to how we started, we know that the shifts are involved in this, and we have really the major shift that happens here. We also can talk about the secondary shift that happens towards the end. Once he comes to understand it, we notice that there is that so shift that happens. Yeah, he says, but, and then he says, I feel my heart new open. Think about that like the so shift. Because of what's happened, I have seen a change. We know that we're going to have to talk about this as a multifaceted response. So we can employ our blank yet blank construction to help us out to write this thesis that can drive our analysis. What are some words that we can use to talk about Wolsey's, mindset, his tone, his ideal at any point in this passage? We're just going to brainstorm words. Give me some. They can be words that are up here too. Discuss. Resentful. Huh? Bitter. Angry. Sad. What else? Understanding. Hostile.
Reflectful.
Mm-hmm. Or even reflective. Mournful. Any others? Any others word there? Oh yeah. A word that can go over here with some of these thoughts about how he is a great word that we can employ, caustic. If you describe something as caustic, you usually hear it in science with like an acid. It eats through things. When we describe your words as caustic, it's those times that you're being so negative and so intentionally hurtful that you're hoping that your words spit venom at that person. You want that, and we definitely see it in how Wolsey approaches the early parts of this. I talked about other words that I came up with: beaten down, hopeless, understanding is there. We talk about sarcastic. Either way, all we wanted to do was to gather some words to help, because this step can be really difficult for some people when we transition to, okay, understand all about the passage. Now I got to try to put a word to how to describe his response. And we see it in some of the theses that we're responding to. They're not specific. You're telling me that Wolsey has a complex response, but you're choosing not to bring those words up to help to frame your essay. You're hoping that they're going to come to you as you go through the rest of the piece. Taking a second to just throw words out can help you out, because think about how we start with a word like angry or sad. It's a really basic way to describe an emotion. I think about one of the gifts my kid got for Christmas is this like little learning pad. And one of the things that go on it is like emotions. So it'll ask like, which face is angry? Which face is happy? You think about this is a really basic emotion. But is resentful a form of being angry? It's just a more specific way of describing it. Same thing with bitterness or disgust. You could start by, in a general sense, saying that person's angry, and then later you go, they're more bitter. That's a better way to say it. Taking this time to throw words out sometimes will allow you to go, yeah, that's a good word, but ooh, this is better. This is a little more specific. It lets you capture it a little bit easier. We will be rewriting this essay tomorrow and redrafting. That doesn't mean that the expectation is you literally heave out what you did Monday and we start fresh. For some of you, you might want to because you're just like, oh my God, I understand this so much better. I'm ready to go. For others, it may be the matter of just improving the product. Maybe we go back and we look at your thesis and we bring some of these words in and reframe paragraphs that are already working. We're going to look at redrafting tomorrow for improvement. Turn this off because our goal is to try to push